I'm talking about a lot of things, maybe too many things. We'll see how the day goes. But in America, after the American Revolution was over, and as you know, when you looked at Chapter 6, there was an expansion of democracy, right? The voting qualification for white men was reduced considerably, which extended the right to vote to many people. Many people were still left out, but more were brought into the democratic system of government. We saw the expansion of the toleration of different religions. We saw the abolition of slavery in the North. The explosion of democracy that really defines early America takes place in Chapter 10. It's the age of President Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, to this day, is still regarded as one of those game-changing presidents. Like, we've had many presidents in America, but the only ones that you all are familiar with are the ones that are on the currency, the money, or they've got really special places in our history. For instance, George Washington, our first president. Everyone knows George Washington. Thomas Jefferson, also a big name, big defender of democracy, etc., etc. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Franklin Delano Roosevelt fought World War II and got the country out of the Great Depression. And then, in the last couple of generations, people have different favorites. JFK, who was a very charismatic leader of the Democratic Party, first Catholic president. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who brought us the Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, the war on poverty, affirmative action. That was that guy. Of course, he also got us into Vietnam, so he's got a mixed legacy. Ronald Reagan, some consider him to be the conservative demigod of modern American politics. Others consider him to be not a very nice person. And I'm using that term because I'm being recorded. But there are other terms I could use. President Bill Clinton, some consider him to be the greatest Democratic president of the 20th century. Well, except for FDR. And others think that he was a sellout. And then, of course, there's mixed opinions on Obama. But these are all... what's that?
George Bush.
I respect the right not to talk about him. Now, all right. Now, but these are all recent presidents in living memory, so people can talk about them. In the 19th century, it's basically Abraham Lincoln in the middle, Thomas Jefferson at the beginning, and then actually, believe it or not, after Abraham Lincoln, there was no major president that was a game changer. Everyone else was weak or compromised. But before Lincoln and after Jefferson, there was Jackson. If there was a trajectory of presidents that expanded democracy, you had Jefferson, who fought for the abolition of the Alien and Sedition Acts and defended the right of the people to protest their government. He fought on that behalf to expand democracy. Then you had Lincoln, who freed the slaves and abolished slavery with the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment granted all people born in this country the right to equal citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment gave all men, regardless of race, the right to vote, at least at the federal level. I know the state governments imposed Jim Crow, and I'll talk about this later. But in the middle, the guy that expanded democracy the most was President Andrew Jackson, who not only expanded democracy the most, but also gave us the modern system of American politics, which is both good and bad. The modern system of American politics is very much, how do I get as many people to vote for me as possible? And in a nation where the democracy is extended to, at this time, all white men, regardless of education, background, upbringing, whatever, as a politician, you can't stand in front of them and start quoting from political philosophers and be complicated. You have to do what modern politicians do. You get up there, you take a complicated issue, and you reduce it to a simple answer, which everybody understands, and you repeat it over and over and over again. That's modern American politics. It's basically theater. It's showmanship. You try to convince as many people to vote for you as possible by not getting too complicated, because people lose attention, right? You also want to destroy your opponent, because in the modern world of democracy, where getting voters to the poll is only half the battle, you have to make sure they vote for you and certainly not vote for the other guy. So convince the people of the validity of your ideas and also destroy the character of your opponent. What we do in American politics now didn't just happen 1 minute to spare. How about this? You can close the door since you're the 1 minute to spare person. Now, and it's actually 5:46. 7, you're very lucky. I got so distracted by my talk of democracy. But what we do in American politics today is not new. The attack ads, the scurrilous stories on the internet, we were doing this in the 1820s and 30s, except back then it was in newspapers and in person in the big speeches, when you give political speeches. This is modern American politics. The amount of money that's involved in modern American politics, where you reward your friends by giving them jobs in government and then deny it to your enemies by, firing them or not returning their phone call, that didn't start now. That started back then when the modern Democratic Party and the modern political party system began. Because the political parties of the 1790s, with the Republicans and the Federalists, they were the first political parties, but they weren't mass political parties. Why? Because not all men had the right to vote then. During the age of Jackson, when all white men have the right to vote, the political parties become professional organizations that are working round the clock year after year, because now you're bringing to the polls millions of people. Before, political parties, they only did that electioneering closer to elections. Now, political parties, they have someone going. They have staffs. They have the, what are they called, chairman of the Democratic Party, later the Republican Party, where they are working day in and day out to win elections at the city, the state, the federal level, president, Congress. They're working all the time. All of that, which we take for granted now, happened here when democracy was expanded to all white men. Politics became professional, but it also became more corrupt, and it became much more theatrical, and in some cases, maybe not always as reliable. But that's a matter of opinion. So, in this period after the War of 1812, you have a drastic expansion of democracy. Every new state, when they entered the Union after the War of 1812, they didn't have any property qualifications. If you were white and male, you had the right to vote. And there was millions of people flooding into Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Mississippi, Texas. Well, not Texas yet, but Alabama, etc. They all had the right to vote. And all the original colonies, the original 13 states, they gradually reduced and eliminated any qualification, property qualification for voting. By 1860, only Rhode Island had a property qualification to vote, which means in the entire country, if you were male and white, you had the right to vote. This is the most democratic system of government. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm saying compared to all other systems of government in the world at that time, America is the most democratic place. And that has consequences for its political decision-making. Why did this happen? In Chapter 9 of your book on the market revolution, I asked you, after reading Chapter 9, to define how did people look at liberty in the market revolution, in the midst of all that economic opportunity. What did people want? What did people feel entitled? And most of you answered, the right to be left alone. The right not to be interfered with by governments or taxes or laws or anything to take advantage of all of this economic opportunity. Individualism, the right to self-fulfillment. Well, if you are a believer in the cult of individual self-fulfillment in a country that technically is a democracy where the vote is the most powerful thing a citizen can have, you really don't have any justification to deny it to people just because they don't have enough money in their pocket or education or whatever. And thus, you had this expansion of democracy to all white men. Now, let me see. Let me just pass ahead. But what does that mean? If the right to individual self-fulfillment means that you should extend the right to vote, because before, the argument was the only people you can trust to be independent-minded and intelligent enough to vote for the good of the country and not for their own selfish interests are people that are independent. They have their own farm, they own their own business, they don't work for anybody else. They're independent, and so they can make virtuous or unselfish decisions. Well, once you get rid of the property qualification and you say citizenship requires the vote regardless of income, so does that mean that women should have the vote as well?
No.
Does that mean Native Americans? Does that mean blacks, free or slave, should be given the vote? And that's where things start to get interesting in American democratic history. Because the language of equality no longer works if before people were comfortable saying equality of the vote to all people that are independent and virtuous, and we can measure that by people that have money in their pocket. And that was easy to do because slaves don't own property. Most blacks that are free didn't own enough property to have the right to vote, and women weren't legally allowed to own their own property. So you could legally exclude a whole lot of people without making too much of a fuss about anything. You could just say property and not bring up race or gender. But once you take property out of the equation and say all men have the right to vote, now you are bringing race and gender into the equation. All men, black men too? Well, no. Well, why? What if a black man is free and wants to vote and has an education? Why would you deny him the right to vote? What about a woman who has an education, maybe even owns her own property? How can you deny that the right to vote? Now the ugly sort of undercurrent of American democracy comes forward. And you already know this. We read the Constitution, and there's not a single mention of the word slavery, and yet the entire document, not the entire document, but much of the document, protects property understood to be slavery. So there is this racial undercurrent that it doesn't come up because it gets ugly when you're talking in the lofty tones of all men are created equal. But it's there, and we've discussed that. But it really comes out in the open at this time. If you're saying that owning property should not disqualify you from voting, well then how do you disqualify blacks and women from voting, which none of these people were ready to extend the vote to? Now you start making the racist and the gender-based argument. Blacks and women are simply not prepared to vote. Whether you say they're inferior racially or gender-wise, they're not prepared. They're like children. That is the justification for all this, for denying the right to vote. So in this period, while Americans are celebrating the expansion of democracy, look, all white men have the right to vote, regardless of education and property, they're also specifically stating that the right to vote and citizenship is for whites and males only. The cat's out of the bag, essentially. You can no longer hide behind that. So it becomes a racial democracy at this time. Now, the second theme from the age of Jackson that I want to talk about is an expansion of nationalism. There's been an expansion of democracy, and I've just pointed out the complications, but there's also an expansion of nationalism. And here's what happened. The War of 1812 against Britain, basically we won because we still kept our independence, and Britain finally backed off and stopped interfering with our trade and our borders and so on and so forth. Although other people say it was a draw because they burned down parts of Washington, the White House, and there was a standoff in the battles. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. At the end of the War of 1812, politicians looked around and they said to themselves, that was an incredibly difficult war, fought in the North, on the Atlantic, and in the South, and America is too big and poorly developed to fight and defend all of our borders. It was just too hard to fight battles in the South, in the North. Why? Roads, railroads, canals, infrastructure. America doesn't have it. Now, remember, the market revolution was all about building the infrastructure. And it starts off with the states doing the investing. But slowly but surely, the national government realizes we can't stay out of this. No state is going to build a transcontinental railroad. Only the federal government can do that. Moreover, the War of 1812 showed America must be an industrial nation to compete on the global stage. But America is a young industrial nation. Britain is a mature industrial nation, and they are kicking our behind. We need to protect American manufacturers so that they develop and they compete on the global stage. But how do you protect American manufacturers? You've got to keep foreign, cheaper goods out of the country. Well, who's in charge of that? The national government. So the national government has to impose an economic policy that keeps out cheaper foreign goods. Well, where's the problem with that? Every time you talk about new national government policies, you're going to have the same problem this country has always had. Southerners are more about farming, and they believe in free trade. Northerners are more and more industrial, and they want the protection of their growing industry. There's a difference in what it is the federal government should be doing. So, you have this beginning of a split. Remember after the... Okay, forgive me, but it's bloody hot in here. And I'm going to pass out up here. All right. I already called engineering and left a message, but evidently, you see, I'm recording, and I can't be nasty, so I'm going to say nothing. Now, do you remember Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson? They went head-to-head in the 1790s, and they had different opinions about what the federal government should do. Alexander Hamilton said the federal government should protect manufacturing, raise taxes, build an army, blah, 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 blah. And Jefferson said, no, we should develop farmers and not get involved in the economy because that just favors certain people, and so on and so forth. And then after the War of 1812, the Federalist Party disappeared. They were accused of being unpatriotic, and nobody voted for the Federalist Party anymore. So everybody was technically a Republican, a Thomas Jefferson Republican. What's the problem? The problem is the North is still industrial. The South is still plantation-based slave labor. So even though the Federalist Party disappeared, the needs that were met by the Federalist Party didn't go anywhere. And so you had one Republican Party, but those Northerners who wanted protection for their industry, federal funding for infrastructure, roads, canals, railroads, which meant higher taxes, which meant bigger government, those people, even though they're in the Republican Party, they still had those interests, and they started coming to the fore. And so you see like a split in the one-party Republican Party, the state. What emerges is the American system. The American system is virtually identical to the economic ideas of Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Party of the 1790s. So even though they were technically in the party of Thomas Jefferson, because it was uncool and unpolitic to be a member of the Federalist Party, you still had northern interests, you still had manufacturing interests that wanted their government to protect them. And so you had these Republicans who came out with this idea that the federal government needs to take over and expand what the states are doing. The states are building some railroads, some roads, some canals. The federal government has got to connect and coordinate everything, because there has to be a national solution to national problems, not what New York is doing, Georgia, etc. Georgia's not building a transcontinental railroad. Only the American government can, because it has the money and the coordinating ability. Moreover, we need to develop our manufacturing. Well, who can do that? Not the state of New York, but the federal government. And again, Alexander Hamilton's early idea was you need one Central American bank that regulates interest rates and currency in order to bring stability to American market. These are all against the ideas of Thomas Jefferson and that wing of the Republican Party. Because all of this, it makes the government too big, too powerful, raising too many taxes and getting involved in people's lives too much. So the Federalist Party was almost reborn within the Republican Party under a different name. Supporters of the American system. And by the way, this is already the beginning of naming things with a name that you can't be against. How can you be an enemy of the American system? That would make you un-American. Clever naming, right? But it also means American as not individual states, but the whole country would benefit from this. Now, the leading architects of this new wing within the Republican Party, this new wing were called the Nationalist Republicans. So remember, there's only one party, the Republican Party. There's the old wing, the traditional Republicans from Thomas Jefferson with those ideas of small government, make more farms, etc., more farmers. But the new wing, the Nationalist Republicans, these guys are basically like the old Federalist Party reborn with a different name. Henry Clay of Kentucky, John Calhoun of South Carolina, both of these guys were supporters of the War of 1812 because they felt America needed the free trade, which was interfered by Britain, and the ability to expand to the West, which was interfered by Britain. They were strong state politicians, but acting on the national stage. Now, right after the War of 1812, these guys, right from the very beginning, were saying the Federalist Party is dead, but some of their ideas are pretty good. We do need industry. We do need railroads. We do need to develop America internally. We can't ignore that. Some of them got passed by James Madison, the guy that came after Thomas Jefferson, the guy who fought the War of 1812. He did not fund internal, like federal funding of canals, roads, etc. He thought that was too much. Madison believed in the old Jeffersonian idea that the federal government has to remain small and limited. The more it does, the more it taxes the people, the more it impoverishes the people. So the federal government shouldn't be building railroads and roads. That isn't our business. That's a state matter. But Madison did believe to introduce a tariff which would protect American developing factories, which was new. Jefferson was not into this at all, but Madison recognized America has to compete on the industrial stage. And he also believed, which is another thing that Jefferson would have disagreed with, America does need a bank, a central bank to help regulate its expanding wealth. So already the Nationalist Republicans, even with the Federalist Party dying, have already won a couple of things. This bank is responsible for actually issuing paper money on a national stage, collecting the taxes from the people for the federal government, and then using it for, it is the one institution to collect the money centrally that the government then spends. It is the institution that will pay off the government debts, maintaining the government's credits. And most importantly, it will regulate how much currency each local bank gets. So that way, there is one person or one group that knows this is how much currency is in America, what each bank has, and so there's no danger of one bank like printing more money, which then reduces its value, and no one believes. You understand that the money you have in your pocket, whether it's coins or paper, has no actual value, right? You understand that? Like nothing has any value unless we all agree that it has value, right? Gold is not inherently valuable. We've just said it is because it's rare and we use it for a lot of things. The money in your pocket is only as valuable as what we believe it is what its value is. And because we live in a global economy, the value of the American currency is dependent on how it's viewed around the world. So this is what the bank's job was, making sure the American currency was respected both at home and abroad. The problem was that there was a panic in 1819. There was way too much money loaned out at a time when people were flooding out west and they needed loans to buy land, to develop farms, etc. And there was this feeling that America is expanding, it's prospering, and it's going to keep expanding, which means there was a lot of loans made. There was a lot of speculative buying. Speculative buying is basically gambling. You borrow because you assume you yourself will always have enough income to pay off the debts. You're speculating you will always have enough income to pay off your increasing debts. And then when you don't, you lose everything. And that is pretty much the history. And actually it's right there on the wall. I didn't put it there, but there it is. That is the boom-bust cycle of the American capitalist system. Up, everyone's confident. Down, everyone's bankrupt. Up, everyone's confident, spending money, hand over fist, bankrupt. Up and down. And we just lived through a couple of, a major recession ourselves, which we're still pulling ourselves up. Now, the Panic of 1819, what do you need to know about it? Basically, the central bank, the central bank, the Bank of the United States, was blamed for this. The central bank was blamed for being irresponsible, corrupt, favoring the rich, exploiting the poor, and so this bothered many of the traditional Republicans who felt if you give too much money to one organization, a central bank, the poor will always get screwed. Because when the Panic of 1819 happened and land values collapsed because everybody realized there was too much on the market, rich people took a bit of a beating, poor people lost everything. Just like happens in every stock market crash. Now, another major development in terms of this growing nationalist sentiment is people are moving westward. Notice. No, I'm not. Are you? All right. Another development in this time that has something to do with the growing nationalist sentiment are people are moving out west. And because they're moving out west, you have all this development of the railroads and the roads and all that stuff I talked about earlier. But they're moving out west, and they're settling in land, which is technically, it's American territory, but it's not a state yet. And the way it works is, when America achieved its independence, and then it got all that land from the original 13 colonies all the way to the Mississippi River, and then it got the Louisiana Purchase. It's all American territory. The only thing left that isn't ours is California and the Southwest, which is still Mexico, and Oregon, which is jointly administered, Oregon and Washington, which are jointly administered with Great Britain. So America has all this territory that people are flooding into. Once you get a certain amount of people there, they get together, they form a local government, and they petition the national government to enter the United States as an actual state. Not the territory of Missouri, but the state of Missouri, which means they get 2 senators in the Senate, they get representatives in the House of Representatives, and most importantly, they get electoral college votes to vote for the president. Where's the problem? The problem is, if the national government has to vote on the acceptance of a new state in the Union, politics gets involved. What kind of politics? The guys in D.C., which are pretty much divided, the northern senators and representatives are all from states where slavery has been abolished. The southern senators and representatives are all from slave-owning states. And by this point, the slave trade is over. You can't bring in more slaves into the country. And the cotton trade is expanding, so the dependence on slavery becomes tighter. So the commitment of the South to slavery and the political power needed to protect slavery is huge. So Missouri comes in and it says, we want to enter the United States of America, but a lot of our people came here with slaves. We want to come in with a constitution, a state constitution, that recognizes the legality of slavery in the new state of Missouri. Well, Southern senators who were voting for this said, hell yes, vote them in. Northern senators said no, because then you have one extra slave state to our non-slave states, and there's a political imbalance in the Senate. And we're not going to give you that. We're just not going to vote on it. But now there's all these people living in Missouri who are ready to form a local government. They want to enter the United States. And the longer this territory is undeveloped, the less profitable it is, and the less safe America's borders are. So it's got to get done. This is the Missouri controversy. And it's the first of the many compromises which you will end up seeing in your final exam, where the North and the South said, okay, how do we get this done without ripping the country apart? And you've seen these compromises before. When it came to slavery and the Constitution, how'd they figure it out? 3/5, right? And the South got the Fugitive Slave Clause and the extension of the slave trade until 1808. This was another one of those compromises. Do you want Missouri? Fine. As a slave state, we'll vote for it. You got to give us something. Let's create the state of Maine. I'll show you on a map in a moment. But the state of Massachusetts used to be twice its current size. The current state of Maine used to be part of the current state of Massachusetts. So they cut it off, they named it the state of Maine, and it became a non-slave holding state. But more importantly, a line was drawn on the map, and it said, all slavery north of Missouri's southern border, and I'll show you a map in a second, will not be allowed in the future, because we don't want to have this fight every time a new state wants to enter the Union. So let me show you. 13 original states, all the new states that entered the Union after the War of 1812 and a little bit beforehand, Mississippi River. All the green is the Louisiana Purchase, purchased by Thomas Jefferson in 1803, I think. And all these, so Arkansas, 1836, Missouri, 1821, Iowa, 1846. This was the first state that came in. And they said they wanted to be a slave state. So, Maine was created up here. That used to be attached to Massachusetts. This became a free state. This became a slave state. Political balance is maintained. But what about all this other Louisiana territory? Because remember, this, and this still belongs to Mexico or Britain. It's not ours. So the issue was, we don't want to have a fight about the rest of the Louisiana territory. So let's set up a rule now so that we don't have this fight in the future. And the rule was this. Draw a line from Missouri's southern border across the Louisiana Purchase. Everything north of it, no slaves. Everything south of it, do whatever you want. All right? So keep an eye on that, because Kansas is going to get troublesome in 1861, but that's not for today. But that's what the Missouri Compromise was. Draw a line from the bottom of Missouri across the Louisiana Purchase. Everything to the north, no slave. Everything to the south, do whatever you want. That's the Missouri Compromise. Now, all of this talk about America, it needs a stronger, more involved federal government. It's got to build railroads. It's got to protect industry. All of this talk and this split in the Republican Party eventually leads to the reemergence of two parties. Forget about this for now. I'm not going to test you on that. You can look at it up in the textbook if you need to. But focus on the election of 1824. It's 12 years after the War of 1812 is over. It's 9 years after, it's 9 years after the end of the War of 1812. The Federalist Party is dead and gone. It's just one party, the Republican Party. But within it, there is a wing called the Nationalist Republicans that believe in the old Federalist ideas, and they're not going away. They realize they're going to have to run their own candidate if they want their issues adopted by a president at the national level. So, in 1824, you have the reemergence of the two-party system. The Republicans, and then the old traditional Republicans, and the Nationalist Republicans. John Quincy Adams, the son of America's first vice president, and the guy who took over after George Washington. His dad, John Adams, was a Federalist. He was running as a Nationalist Republican. Believed in the same ideas as his dad, but he couldn't take the Federalist Party name because it was unpopular. But he ran on the same principles. And he won in the election of 1824. But he only won with Northern support because in the North, that is the old Federalist Party stronghold. They wanted federal funding for railroads, for ports, for canals. They wanted the federal government to impose a tariff that protected industry. They wanted a strong national bank, etc., etc., etc. What happened to the old traditional Republican Party, the party that believed in small government, the old Thomas Jefferson ideas? They renamed themselves the Democratic Party, or what is known today as the Democratic Party. So the modern-day Democratic Party is born in the election of 1824. They lost that election. The Nationalist Republicans elected John Quincy Adams. And he, maps. I love maps. I love maps. Let's see. It's 1824. Yes. As you can see, the Nationalist Republicans, the Adams folks, they were very strong in the North. Jackson, very strong in the South, and always Pennsylvania. The Democrats and the old traditional Republicans always did great in Pennsylvania, and a little bit of the Midwest states, farming states. But as you can see, the Federalist Party is locked in the North. Now, this new Democratic Party, led by Andrew Jackson, was incredibly upset that they lost this election. They felt they were robbed in this election. They felt they were robbed. And they couldn't stomach the idea that the new president, John Quincy Adams, was completely reversing the ideas of traditional Jeffersonian republicanism. Small government, low taxes, etc., etc. And so the original Democratic Party went with the old Thomas Jefferson ideas, which is, to protect individual liberty, you must keep government as small and as unintrusive as possible. That's the only way you're going to protect liberty in America. Keep government small and weak. That was the theme of the Democratic Party. Which means if you're reducing the power of the federal government, then real governing should be done at the state level. The states are a smaller form of government. They're more responsive to the needs of their people. They're less prone to be corrupt. The Democratic Party got the same voters that Jefferson did when he was running. The Southern planters, because of their belief in free trade, limited government, low taxation. The small farmers, again, because the Democratic Party, like the old Jeffersonian Republican Party, believed in supporting agriculture and not industry. But interestingly enough, the Northern workers, the same guys that voted for Thomas Jefferson on the principle that this guy will protect my right to vote and my civil rights, they voted for the new Democratic Party based on the principle that these guys will protect civil rights. Even though as a Northern worker, you would want an economic system that protected industry. But they vote against their economic interests, which is not uncommon in America. John Quincy Adams only had one term as president. Andrew Jackson, in the 4 years while after he lost the election of 1824, was busy with his modern Democratic Party. He was busy going through the country, organizing voters, getting ready for the next election, making sure he wasn't robbed, as he said he was, in the election of 1824. In this election, the presidential election of 1828, the Democrats were incredibly successful because they remembered the lesson of Thomas Jefferson, who ran for president in 1800. The Democrats under Andrew Jackson, just like Jefferson's party in 1800, portrayed themselves as defenders of the people. Even though Andrew Jackson was incredibly wealthy, a plantation and slave owner, he portrayed himself as sympathetic to the common man. Unlike the elitists, like John Quincy Adams and all of his friends in the Nationalist Republican Party, who don't respect the needs of the people. They just want to raise taxes and expand the role of government against the protection of the people's interests. This was the way the press wrote about this presidential election. Jackson is the warrior and Democrat against Adams, the elitist. It went both ways, too. Jackson accused Adams of being an elitist, undemocratic. Adams' people went after Jackson as a murderer because he engaged in duels, which, the sort of, you walk 10 paces away from each other, turn and shoot. You ever heard about this?
Yeah.
Okay. These are technically illegal, but to defend your honor, men did it, privately. It used to be sword play, and then now it was shooting. So he did that, he killed the guy, and, technically, they said, well, you're a murderer, even though everybody engaged in dueling. More scathing, they accused his wife of being, because I'm recording, I'm not going to say the word, but let's say impure. Because she got she became involved with Jackson when she was technically still married to another man, although they had been separated for a long time. And as you know, women can't file for, I'm telling you, women don't have the legal right to file for divorce unless under extreme situations. All right? So technically, Jackson was involved with a woman who was already committed to somebody else. And so, they went after his family, the way in modern politics we often do. But they won anyway, because Jackson did what Jefferson did in 1800. This is a modern American democracy. You need to get people to the polls. So you have to get out there and talk to the people, simple answers to complex questions, and just saturate them with vote for me and absolutely don't vote for that guy. It became incredibly partisan, meaning it was all about attack that guy. There's none of this, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, like Jefferson said in his speech in 1801. It was just all out, destroy the other side, because we need to get our people to the polls and keep their people at home. In the election of 1828, this is Adams retained most of the Northeast, just like he did in 1824, but now he lost half of New York State. And in addition to Pennsylvania, he lost every other state, excuse me. Like, look at this landslide for Jackson in 1828. In the 1824 election, there were other candidates that broke up the Southern voting bloc. In 1828, there's no one else. It was just Jackson versus Adams. And Adams couldn't get more than just the traditional Northeastern voters who always voted for the Federalist Party or the National Republicans. Jackson got everybody else. Southern plantation farmers, small farmers in the West, and city folk who bought into this democratic message of small government. The age of Jackson brought us new politics. Like I mentioned, politics is now public. It's not about the elites making the decision with a few limited voters. Now it's a show. You've got to get as many people to the polls as possible. And you got to make it fun. You got to be a good public speaker. The posters have got to be colorful. They've got to have big words that catch your attention when you're walking by. Even if you just have that split second, like, right, Jackson good, Adams bad. It's got to be simple. The politicians at this period now become heroes. They get nicknames. They get stories. Jackson is sold as the modern warrior who won the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, who I think his nickname was Old Hickory, which made him sound like a more common individual, something that the common man, and remember, when it comes to voters, most people are just the common man, not the elite. From this point forward, politicians are made as personal as possible. You know those commercials you see when guys are running for office, or women, or anybody are running for office? They get in front of the TV and they say, "Hello, my name is. Let me tell you something about myself. My dad worked in a mill. My mom raised 4 kids, and had a part-time job, and so on and so forth. I put myself through college, and none of this stuff matters to you. You just want to know things like, are you going to bring America to war or not? Are you going to raise my taxes or not?" But that's for you. You're a savvy bunch of voters. Most voters don't follow politics as closely. It's like, yeah, whatever. Do I like you? That's fine. I trust you. Go ahead. You got my vote. You know that's the way it works. Otherwise, why would you care if a politician goes to church or not? Or if a woman politician had an abortion or not? Why would you care? Right? Because we vote on what we agree with a sympathetic personality. Most of us. Few of us, hopefully, make much more, informed opinions. Now, the party machine is invented at this time, meaning we need to get as many loyal people on our side as possible. How do you get loyal people? Buy them off. That's simple. The Democrats mastered the art of, if you don't vote for us, when we win, we are not returning a single telegram. And all of your friends will never get any jobs, because the federal government has a lot of jobs to give out, and a lot of jobs it can create, and a lot of contracts that it awards, and a lot of things that it could order for the U.S. Army, Navy, railroads, canals. Now, do you want that business going to you or to your competitor? To you? Well, then you better get your friends out to vote. You better have a fundraiser. You better deliver that money to the Democratic headquarters. If you don't, we go to your competitor. And that's the way it works. It's organized bribery and rewarding your friends and punishing your enemies. And it's a full-time job now. It's not just, whenever there's an election going. No, because you need your friends 24/7, 365 days a year. The national conventions are born at this time, where you bring Democrats and Republicans together, all together, in one city, one time, have a big party, get the morale up, get a national nominating convention going, saying, who do we want for president, and work out all your differences, so when you're done, everybody's behind that one person that is put forward by the national party. And the newspapers. The newspapers at this time were absolutely biased. There was no such thing as a balanced news story. There were Democratic papers, and there was the Nationalist Republican papers. If you were a Democratic paper, everything Andrew Jackson did was good. And everything that John Quincy Adams did was bad. End of story. That's it. And vice versa if you were a paper supporting the other side. Let me see. All right. What you really need from this is sort of like the first points, not the indented ones. That's just for me. The Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson was essentially the remake of the old Thomas Jefferson Republican Party of 1800 to 1808. They talked the talk of equality, not rich versus poor, but the government must be for the common people. It must defend civil rights. It must keep taxes low and not put such a huge burden on poor people. That was their talk, and that's what made them most powerful, really, in a democratic nation. The Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson absolutely despised federal funding for national projects, because that means more money to spend, more taxes, and the poor get screwed with it. So Jackson was not interested in a national bank. He was not interested in funding too much national projects like railways, etc. He wanted to curb that back. He wanted to protect the states' rights critically, reduce the federal government and respect states' rights. At least that's what he said until he became president, and I'll talk about that in a second. But also, their belief in individual rights wasn't just keep the taxes low and keep your hands out of people's pocket. It was about morality. The Federalist Party, the Nationalist Republicans, they were an elitist party. They feared too much democracy. And remember, this is a time where the immigrants start to come over by the thousands and the millions. And they're coming from poor Catholic Ireland, or they're coming from Germany. Two nations where drinking is a part of the culture. And I'm not saying they're alcoholics, I'm saying drinking is a part of their culture like football is a part of our culture. But America doesn't have a drinking culture like Ireland and Germany did. And now there's these millions of immigrants coming in, different languages, different religions. And the old Federalists and the Nationalist Republicans felt the need to educate, morally guide these people. How? Well, shut down the bars on a Sunday. You should be in church on a Sunday, so you're not allowed to open a bar on a Sunday. But the thing is, these are immigrants, working class people who work 6 days a week. They want to go drinking on a Sunday or at night. And they resent the government limiting their options. So for the Democratic Party, individual rights is not just low taxes, it's also, you know what, we're not in the business of regulating morality. You want to go drinking on a Sunday? Have at it. That's your business. It's not our job to teach you how to be moral. That's what freedom means to us. We're going to not get in your way. So who supported the Democratic Party? Well, the farmers, because farmers don't like high taxes. They don't need government protection. They need free trade. Workers, because they love the whole emphasis on strong individual rights and low taxes. Catholics, big Democratic Party supporters, mostly Irish, who came over, and the Democratic Party said, I don't care what God you pray to, vote Democrat. Okay. And that's how they got the Democratic Irish vote. Obviously the immigrants, not just Irish, but German, and Southerners and Westerners because of their agricultural policies. That's how Jackson destroyed Adams. He appealed to people's economic interests, democratic interests, and well, that's basically it, economic and democratic interests. So who were his opponents? The Nationalist Republican Party, for reasons that I haven't quite mastered, changed their name to the Whig Party. They were originally the Nationalist Republican Party, but now they changed their name to the Whig Party. Partly because that's the name used by the Democrats against them, and then they decided to own the name as a form of pride. So now you have two parties. I know it's been changing, but right now, all you got to... Actually, are you okay? Yeah. All right. I know it's a lot of parties. Two parties. It's the Democratic Party versus the Whig Party. All right? That's all you got to know for now. There used to be one party, the Republicans. Now, they've broken apart, and it's just the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. And just to really spice it up, the Democratic Party has its roots in the old traditional Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson, right? And to make it really confusing, when the modern Republican Party is reborn, the one of George Bush and Abraham Lincoln, it's got nothing to do with the old Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson. So then you might say, why is everybody using the name Republican? Because it's a good, catchy name. Why do we have the Democratic and the Republican Party? Because it encapsulates America. Are we a democracy? Yes. Then we're the Democratic Party. Oh, okay. What else are we? Well, we're a republic. We don't have a king. The people have all the power. Great. Then we're the Republican Party. They're good, catchy names. We could call them the Apple and Oranges Party, but that's not catchy. Right?
Party was not catchy either.
At the time it was. At the time it was, because the Whig... Okay. See, blame him. And I can't say the name, but he's sitting in the front row. And he's frequently tardy. But the Whig Party, man, I blame him. When Andrew Jackson took over as president, even though he claimed that federal government must keep its outreach limited, it must respect its limits as written in the Constitution, Jackson, like Jefferson, did whatever the hell he wanted when he became president. Why? Because he was president. He could do whatever he wanted. So he did. His opponents accused him of being a dictator, of doing things that he didn't really have any legal right to do in the Constitution. They accused Andrew Jackson of being a dictator, of not respecting the rights of Congress and his political opposition. So they adopted the name the Whig Party, because the Whig Party, traditionally in England, was the party that stood up against absolute government, against unconstitutional government. So it was a political choice, because at the time, all Americans would know, the Whig Party, right, like the ones who defended constitutional government in England. I get it. So at the time, it was catchy. Now to us, it's, why is there an H in Whig? But that's where it came from. Again, he's the one to blame for that digression. Now, oops, let me go back. Their claim was, you know what? In America, everybody has equal rights that is a citizen. Now, again, they're ignoring slavery, women, Native Americans, etc. They're saying, yes, everyone has equal rights as a citizen, but let's be real. Some people are more talented than others. Some people are better at getting an education than others. Some people are more clever than others. Those people have earned the right to be leaders of society, and everyone else should just basically shut up and follow their lead. Not everybody should have the right to participate meaningfully in American democracy, because some are just better able to lead than others. That's a fact of life. The problem is, they said it out loud. And in a country where all white men have the right to vote, why would you vote for the people saying, just vote for us, but we're never going to listen to you again because we think you're not very smart? It's not a great political strategy, right? Additionally, these guys are big believers in the promotion of internal improvements. How? Through taxation, which made sense to some, but to others, they're just like, I don't need a railroad. Why am I paying taxes for a railroad to go to Kansas? I don't care. And then they couldn't sell it. These guys were also big believers that the federal government should do something about promoting morality. How so? Well, we need laws that limit drinking, because we have all these new immigrants that seem to drink for fun, and that's ruining America. We also need to make it legal, not legal, that you have to go to church on Sunday. That should be a law. But most importantly, and this is the one that, even though it's incredibly patronizing, it had the most effect. These people are coming in, they have no education, and we expect them to be independent, free-thinking American citizens and voters. How do we get them there? Well, then we got to pay for education, because they're not getting it anywhere else. So these were the guys that said, we need to pay for public education. We need to make these people more moral, smarter. It's an incredibly patronizing thing to say. But public education, well, hell, we're all here because of public education. It was the empowerment of citizens to be active, to be more active in their citizenry. Their supporters were the same as the Federalists. Businessmen, the farmers that were selling on the market and they wanted protection against cheaper foreign goods, some plantation owners, Protestants, especially the Protestants who were afraid of all the Catholics coming in, and again the Northeast. We're meeting again on Tuesday, so all right. I'm going to leave you with two things, which I'm going to review next class, but then go into greater detail. Remember, for Thomas Jefferson, you had, in chapter 8, we talked about how He ran on the principle of small government, no foreign wars, don't expand the military, all that kind of stuff. And then as soon as he came into office, he did the exact opposite. Do you remember I made that spiel, that speech? Andrew Jackson did the exact same thing. He came in saying, we must respect states' rights, and then the nullification crisis happened where South Carolina refused to obey a federal law. And so he basically threatened South Carolina saying, you either obey the law or I'm going to invade and force you to obey the law. And South Carolina backed down. A drastic expansion of presidential power. The other drastic expansion of presidential power was used to this, to remove Native Americans from land where Jackson wanted whites to settle in. And he and his successor pretty much forced marched Native Americans off their land to reservations further west in the middle of winter, dispossessed them of their property, and thousands died along the way. Also, a drastic expansion of presidential power. That's the other part that Jackson's known about. Defender of democracy, but also rather bad for Native Americans. But I will deal with this on Tuesday. Enjoy your weekend.